Thank you very much, Andrew. I should say 20 years in law rather than in the bank, but it's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you for the opportunity to share some observations on my experience overseas on how you gain traction on risk reduction and resilience, but particularly when you've got multiple stakeholders and how do you make effective progress in the area of disaster risk. And I should also say that I'm going to be speaking in a private capacity. So immediately, I think we can sense the nature of the challenge, and the phrase that springs to mind, if you're talking about multiple stakeholders, is it's a bit like herding cats. So I thought I'd start with a more serious question on what do you think it takes to develop a successful sovereign risk financing or risk transfer program? I mean, who would be implicated in the design? And I can think of 7 categories of stakeholders or groups. You'd have your relevant ministries and departments, national technical organisations, the data providers, the analytic and risk modelling experts, including your academics, actuaries, meteorological, hydrological, geological services. You'd have some sectoral data collectors, such as in primary industries. You'd have the reinsurance industry, domestic insurers, and depending which country we're in, you might have a regional bank. You'd certainly have central, regional and local government to try and generate the buy-in for the program, and you might have some NGOs who are instrumental in promoting the option to a specific group. So it's a lot of people. So let's extrapolate from that example to ask what might it require if in the sort of convoluted, complex landscape of a countrywide campaign on disaster risk reduction, sometimes called DRR, what might that require? Under the International Agreement on Disaster Risk, called the Sendai Framework, by 2030, New Zealand is expected to have achieved the substantial reduction of disaster losses in lives, livelihoods and assets. And that reduction has to be across a whole lot of sectors: economic, physical, social, cultural, environmental assets of persons, businesses, communities and countries. And the associated goal in this agreement calls for the implementation of integrated and inclusive measures. And you can see again, it's across a huge range of spheres. So in terms of expectation, this is extremely encompassing. Encompassing in scope, it's a really big ask. So I thought I'd think about what will that mean for New Zealand if we were to try and have a very comprehensive disaster risk program. Now, the slide is my home region earlier this year in the Eastern Bay of Plenty. There's a real precariousness to living in New Zealand, and caused by the exposure of our lives and livelihoods to a whole range of natural hazards. And Tony talked in passing about cat losses and the need for exposure management. We've got the concentration of people and assets in fault lines, floodplains. He talked about along the coast, on oversteepened hillsides and so on. And you've got really cascading and compounding risks. Think of Wellington after the earthquake, the last round of earthquakes, and the problems with the port. Luckily the airport was okay, but of course then it got hit with a 2-day storm immediately afterwards, compounding everything. You think about the droughts we had last season, the impact on a number of the big rivers, and then of course we had wildfires in 2 parts of the country. So there are no standalone issues. Everything's interdependent. Our economic dependence on agriculture means, of course, we're hugely vulnerable vis-a-vis drought, localised flooding, subsidence, and there are other factors as well. I took this photo visiting Edgecombe a couple of months ago. It hasn't changed, and we talk about the economic impacts from extreme weather events, but there's a real impact in terms of exacerbating poverty. the cost of alternative housing for the people who are living in Edgecombe who are displaced. They can't go elsewhere because the rentals and purchasing price going anywhere else, towards Whakatane out to Tauranga and so on, is too much. And then you've got interrupted supply chains. This is the Manawatu Gorge that's still closed, and there are business failures there. You think about the interrupted supply chain in Northland with the fuel pipeline being ruptured. And then there's the big one, which a number of speakers have spoken to. This is a Herald article in October warning about rising sea levels. And it's a slow onset disaster, climate change, but it does pose the existential risk for us in New Zealand. And it's not just who's living on the coasts. If we're talking about the ocean acidity, the salinisation of water tables, what you can grow, the loss of biodiversity, loss of natural buffers, new pests and diseases, climate refugees, food insecurity, and so on. It's a very troubling picture. So our sustainability is seriously at risk if we are unable to respond with a real sense of urgency, and particularly if we can't respond with scale. These are sustainability challenges, a mega issue, and disaster by disaster responses are just not viable. When you think about our exposure to natural hazards is so dynamic, it's with compounding and increasingly adverse impacts. We're making development choices that create new risk at a rate that far outstrips our capacity to deal. The way in which we're developing means that we're not able to deal with our existing risk, and so we're not even in a position to deal with our future risks. So we're not making inroads on the accumulated risk. There's a lot of effort expended in New Zealand, but the focus has been really on managing the disaster rather than managing the risks. So there's a lot of resourcing, quite appropriately, going into preparedness and recovery, but insufficient attention to the longer term strategies on what I'll call prevention of loss and damage. Now, in my career in the UN, particularly my last job as the director of the UN Office on Disaster Risk Reduction, I saw a growing realisation that really tough problems where there's an overwhelming challenge to try and inspire a global community to take action could only be overcome by working through partnerships and joining forces in collaborative plans and projects, probably music to Nigel Latter's ears with his emphasis on collaboration. So that being the case then, well, how would we get traction in New Zealand? We need both the systems and the mindset that's got to be able to tackle these factors. An exponential increase in projected economic and social costs of disasters. It's not a straight line at all. The connectedness and interdependency of the pieces of the puzzle that will mean we can have an NZ Inc. or a whole of society response. We have to enlist a whole range of disciplines. We have to be able to work across sectors. And of course, somehow we've got to pay attention to all those interfaces, the vertical and the horizontal. So it's an extremely daunting challenge to design an effective, coherent, coordinated and sustainable response that has the requisite scale. And essentially, we're going to have to develop a grand plan that engages government, central, regional, local, the private sector, insurance, banking and investment, infrastructure, services, communities, and all those other civil society actors that we need, the scientists, the technologists, the engineers, the media, the grassroots organisations, the advocates. And in disaster risk jargon, what I'm talking about is known as the, quote, multi-stakeholder approach. Now, there's currently quite a mosaic of actors in New Zealand, and each one working extremely hard, trying to make a difference on disaster risk and resilience. You'll have your own list, but off the top of head, when I was preparing this, I had McDem, DPMC, ODESC, GNS, EQC, Ministry of Environment, the CRIs, various departments, insurance industry, local authority planners, resource consent officials, regional authorities, cities with resilience programs like Christchurch and Wellington, specific projects like the Wellington Infrastructure Resilience Project, high-risk communities like South Dunedin, Hawke's Bay, Franz Joseph, the Lifelines groups, science challenges, research platforms, the university researchers, the Built Environment Infrastructure Group, engineering consultancies, Red Cross, emergency services. I got a whole page of them there. So, thinking about that, the overall impression that one might get of the current status is that we've got many, many actors, but not necessarily all the right ones. I think we might be missing quite a few. There's a strong emphasis, as I said, on emergency response and recovery. There's a lot of knowledge and effort, a lot of experience in managing the disaster, a lot of ad hoc, disparate activity, but the efforts suffer from a lack of coherence, a lack of national integration. There's no countrywide unifying vision, and there's a failure to act in a concerted and coordinated manner. So, okay, who's missing? Which stakeholders should be at the, who else should be at the table of the key stakeholders? And I would ask, where are the planning, development and investment portfolios? The focus on prevention, meaning focus on managing risk rather than just the disaster, requires the commitment and strong engagement of a whole range of government ministries and departments, especially those agencies making investment decisions. And DRR needs to be seen as a fundamental economic concern which is systemic, with major implications for critical and potential losses. And any significant public spending should be tested in terms of whether or not the investment decision was risk sensitive. So that brings me to the second missing factor that we need in New Zealand, and that is a full partnership with the private sector, particularly business. This is a partnership that was started in 2013 in UNISDR, and the idea behind it with the private sector partnership is that we've got to broaden the pool of those stakeholders who are very invested in a successful outcome. And in most economies, if you've got 70 to 85% overall investment being made by the private sector, 80% of the built environment funded by private capital, there's an obvious link in terms of the business role both in creating risk, but more importantly, I think, in solving risk reduction. You know what happens with the supply chains, the vulnerabilities, particularly of the SMEs, disasters being hitting their business performance and so on. I mean, frankly, it's not possible to have a New Zealand-wide disaster loss and damage campaign unless business is on board as a full partner in the development of policy, incentives and implementation. So, okay, you've got multiple stakeholders, that raises many practical issues. First one, how are you going to reconcile all those different interests? And the techniques used in many places is, well, one, you create a common vision. Two, embed some core principles. And three, think about incentivizing through the co-benefits. And the first example of agreeing a common vision is the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. 17 goals arrived at by tough negotiations among 193 countries, which set a global vision on addressing poverty and inequality and climate. And I was involved in some of those discussions in the Secretariat on coherence between disaster risk and the SDGs. And I was really struck by how people came in behind that to see the SDGs and to turn it into a coalescing force, spurring a whole lot of partnerships. And the insurance industry is very present there. There are many examples on how you can harness insurance for sustainable development, such as the partnership between the insurance industry and the local government for sustainability network, which is 1,500 cities. The micro-insurance industry has got stuck in to working proactively around the SDGs. So in New Zealand, hopefully in the future, we will see an initiative by government to arrive at a unifying vision. And the fact that the effort is multi-stakeholder should not absolve government from the responsibility to show leadership in setting a vision and getting traction. and it will be absolutely critical that the leadership's high level, ideally from Prime Minister and Cabinet, needs to be supported by effective champions such as industry leaders, yourselves, mayors, high-profile community advocates, and there are other techniques. For example, in China, which suffers a third of the world's earthquakes, a few years ago they set an annual target of ensuring that their disaster losses should not exceed 1.3% of GDP, and it sort of serves to focus the mind a little bit. New Zealand's ambition and vision on disaster risk is going to require a supporting national strategy, and it's going to require attention and input from those who can really make a difference here. And leadership, of course, has to insist on that multi-stakeholder principle in all policy development and mechanisms. We have to put into place that whole of government approach. Now, the second technique is you get people to sign up to a set of common principles. And the idea is you're creating awareness, commitment, and momentum. And this is the logo for the environmental principles for sustainable insurance. There's a whole lot of examples of where this technique's been used to get people on the same page. The third one I mentioned was looking for shared value, where you create economic value in a way that creates value for society. And this is, I've heard the owner, behind Prime SM City, speak a number of times, and this is a shopping mall developer in the Philippines where they specialise in building big shopping malls, 54 or so across Asia, with a very resilient design by putting in 10% more cost, and it's been tested and they were able to absorb a major flood event and thereby remain open, which then protected 1,500 jobs, all those suppliers, and building trust with their customers and building loyalty. And this is the so-called resilience dividend named by Judith Rodin, the head of the Rockefeller Foundation, where she says that if we become more adept at building resilience, we're going to see new opportunities for growth, innovation, jobs, environmental sustainability, and improved social cohesion. But it still begs the question of that when it comes to action, how do you bring all the parties together? How do you get them all pulling in the same direction for concerted and coherent action? And again, the tactics that are being used internationally, I think, are equally applicable here. Develop shared strategic objectives, come together around a common project need, undertake normative work, prioritise risk governance. And on that first one, shared strategic objectives can help get all the stakeholders lined up in the same direction. The Sendai priorities give the legitimacy to that and can be adopted. Another place where we did that is I was tasked with chairing a UN high-level committee of 29 UN agencies, all working in the space of DRR, all with sort of competing mandates. And the way we did it is we sat down and developed common priorities in the form of a UN plan of action, which has actually ended up being very successful in terms of setting the practice and policy for the UN. So the other technique, of course, is people in resourcing come together around a project where they identify a common need. And I would suggest that addressing the lack of a New Zealand integrated disaster loss database might be a really good project. There's plenty of scope for cooperation in establishing a national data collection program, the interfaces with all the others who are collecting data in New Zealand, including all of you, develop the expertise for modelling of future losses, produce the risk information tools and services so we can standardise some of those and ensure that they're regarded as having integrity. So there's plenty that can be done if we're looking for a project that will pull us all together. The third tactic there is undertaking normative work. And by that I mean you promote universal approaches, such as translating the Sendai framework into the New Zealand context, because that operates as a blueprint and a sort of standard setting document. It's full of recommendations. And New Zealand is obliged to report on the indicators that sit in that document, so it's another reason for paying attention to it. The fourth, and I think probably the biggest, is to prioritise risk governance. And what I mean by that are it's the system of institutions, mechanisms, policies, legal frameworks by which we guide and coordinate and oversee our efforts. And as I mentioned earlier, you've got to have that proactive high-level leadership, but very importantly, risk governance means urgent attention to developing a policy framework. We have to have a framework that operates across the top and can help us develop the coherence. It's a guidance document, but it's very important as an integrator. We'll need a legislative review of some kind because to see where the inconsistencies and the gaps in the law are. Some countries have used the idea of setting up a model law. We'll have to identify key institutions and responsibilities, address the funding requirements, including making sure that we're a bit creative around the full range of financing options that are available. We have to have an open discussion on accountabilities, particularly including how to improve our transparency and scrutiny around decision making, with all of the investment decisions being based on a risk assessment, introducing corporate disclosure in the area of disaster risk. And of course, governance means you have some kind of monitoring and reporting and oversight. Maybe we should have an annual report tabled to Parliament. So I've given you the list there. Never mind, you've got it. All right, so how do we get coordinated? This is just some of the logos I pulled out from some of the partnerships we were working with. We're going to have that integrating effect of the strategy and the policy framework. We've got to have the overt and fully committed leadership, but there are practical measures as well. And when I joined UNICR in Geneva in 2012, I actually joined to manage the consultation phase, the preparation phase, that would then morph into the 2015 negotiation for the Sendai framework. And it was a hugely complicated outreach where we had to make sure it resulted in tangible policy recommendations. There were 193 countries with different government ministries involved. Many of them had national disaster risk authorities. Last count, there are 120 of those. We had to work with the regional bodies, the African Union, the EC, South America, the Arab states. You got the regional development banks we're engaged with, the IGOs like Red Cross, OECD, and the World Bank. We had to work global, regional, and national networks. We had networks of local bodies, networks of mayors, business partnerships, science groups, parliamentarians, and emergency response NGOs. Then we had to make sure we talked to the groups, sectoral groups in health and education. We had to consider, we had to do gender consultations, we had to talk with disability populations, and of course we had a huge number of grassroots and community groups that were all part of that discussion. So it was an awful lot to get organised, frankly. And in terms of carrying out the global coordination mandate, the organisation, UNICR, had a hub and spoke arrangement for implementing disaster risk management. So the global platform that met every 2 years, a big forum. Some of you may have been to the last one in Cancun, 5,500 participants. It's a big knowledge exchange. Each major region in the world had a regional and has an ongoing regional platform. Countries, there are 85 countries that have national platforms as a way of bringing all these stakeholders together. We've got the online repository. We set up interest-based fora like the Safe Schools Forum, and we had business fora for the private sector partnership. So for New Zealand, I think there are critical practical measures that we can take to establish a coordination mechanism in the form of a forum or a national platform. However, it would have to be empowered some way by law or policy to coordinate and report. It would need to be institutionalised with appropriate recognition, support, public awareness. It's going to need tools, expertise, and the capacity to mainstream into the sectoral activities. It's got to be a multi-stakeholder composition. That's a core principle in disaster risk management. and we have to find a way to make the interface with all the other New Zealand groupings and distributed networks who have so much to offer. The lifelines, the science challenges, the resilient organisations, local governments group, industry groups, like insurance and infrastructure. Okay, to conclude, it doesn't have to be like herding cats. New Zealand is small enough, agile enough, well networked and sufficiently creative for us to be able to design dare I say it, a type of grand coalition, and then get organised. There are a number of tactics and measures that I've outlined that are just waiting to get started. We have the people, we just need to get organised. Multiple stakeholders makes things very complicated and labour intensive, but it's also a real strength, because working across all the sectors, all those organisations, is a precondition for a broad-based, comprehensive, effective and New Zealand-wide disaster risk reduction plan. I'd suggest to you we can get plenty of traction if we emphasise the practical measures, the hard-edge side of a robust risk governance. If we have industries such as you, the insurers, who are prepared to demand high-level leadership and push that. If you become champions in your own right, if you're prepared to initiate, and if we are prepared to initiate difficult conversations on risk transfer options and pricing, retreat and relocation, and cross-subsidisation. If you're prepared to share your knowledge, and again I'm thinking here of Nigel's comment, we're wired to connect. And then if we're all prepared, all of us prepared to drive a whole of country grand project to make significant inroads on our accumulated disaster risk. Most importantly, there's a huge role for the insurance industry to use its clout, including pricing signals, dare I say, to support sustainable pathways that are going to prevent unmanageable future economic loss and a lot of social pain. Thank you.